What if a rich man tried to embarrass a maid's son by making him play the violin in front of all his fancy guests? But the boy turned out to be a genius. This one moment shocked everyone, revealed a powerful secret from the past, and changed their lives forever. Don't skip this because the ending will leave you speechless. Dear friend, what you're about to experience is not just a story, it's a deeply human journey about lost resilience and the quiet, unexpected ways love finds us when we need it most. If this is your first time here, I invite you to drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing your voice. And if you're someone who believes in second chances and the hidden strength of ordinary people and in stories that stay with you long after they end, consider subscribing and tapping the bell icon. We share moments that matter. Thank you for being part of this one. Now, let's begin. The lights from Garrett Langston's summer estate bled into the ocean like gold spilling over glass. That night in Martha's Vineyard was meant to be a perfect scene. Crystal goblets live jazz humming under the stars, and a guest list worth millions. But what no one knew was that this lavish gathering was about to become the stage for a quiet act of cruelty that would unravel everything. It started with a boy in a wheelchair. Eli Alvarez wasn't supposed to be there. His mother, Sophie the housekeeper, had been working 14-hour days prepping for the Langston Foundation Gala. She had begged for a sitter in vain. When she showed up that afternoon, flushed and breathless, Eli, tucked under her arm like a secret Garrett, barely glanced at the child. Keep him out of the way was all he said. But Eli, curious and quiet, was drawn to sound. Always had been. While the staff buzzed like bees across the estate, he wheeled himself down unfamiliar corridors until he found the music room. It was a cathedral of silence, velvet walls, a grand piano untouched, and near the far window a violin resting on an ornate stand. He recognized it instantly. Not the brand or value, he was 9 after all, but something in the shape, the wood's golden hue, the tiny crack beneath the bridge. It looked exactly like the one in the faded photo his mom kept folded in her wallet. The one where his grandfather, Arturo Alvarez, held a violin like it was part of his soul. Eli reached for it with trembling fingers. The door slammed open. Garrett Langston stood there, jaw tight. "What do you think you're doing?" Eli froze. "I wasn't going to play it. You just... What Garrett stepped closer. "Do you know what that is? That's a guarneri worth more than your mother's life insurance." Eli didn't answer. He lowered his eyes, trying not to cry. Garrett stared at him, something dark flickering behind his expensive smile. Then, like a switch, he softened. "Tell me, can you play?" a little Eli whispered. That was it. That's all it took. Later that evening, as the guests sipped wine beneath chandeliers strung through trees, Garrett clinked his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "tonight's entertainment is a little unconventional. You see, one of our staff members brought her son. He's never been to anything like this, but he claims he can play the violin." There were polite chuckles. Someone murmured, "How democratic." Sophie's tray rattled in her hands. Her eyes darted toward the far end of the garden, where Eli sat in his chair now, clutching the same violin. Garrett had insisted no backing out. A performance, he said, will help him understand his place. What kind of man does that to a child? The kind of man who thinks empathy is weakness. The kind of man who believes humiliation builds character. But Garrett underestimated one thing. He didn't know who Eli really was. Because Eli wasn't just the help's son. He was Arturo Alvarez's grandson, a musical prodigy hidden by poverty, by circumstance, by the quiet corners of society that people like Garrett never look into. Sophie rushed to Eli's side moments before he was meant to go on. "Sweetheart," she whispered, kneeling in the grass. "You don't have to do this. I'll quit. We'll leave." Eli looked at her. He wasn't crying, he wasn't shaking. His voice was steady. "He wants to laugh at me," Eli said, "but this isn't for him. Then who is it for?" He glanced down at the violin. "For Grandpa, for you." That moment, the courage in his voice, the heartbreak in hers was almost too much to bear. Sophie touched her son's cheek and realized he was no longer just her little boy. He had become something else entirely. A vessel. A voice. And there in the crowd was another man watching Isaac Moreno, the estate's groundskeeper. He saw the boy, the violin, the cruelty unfolding, and he knew something Garrett didn't. That instrument once belonged to Arturo Alvarez. There's always a moment in every story where fate sharpens like a blade. This was that moment. A billionaire's vanity, a boy's quiet defiance, and a forgotten legacy waiting to be heard. Some performances are just about music, but some are about everything that was ever taken away. What happened next would ripple far beyond the garden lights and wine-soaked smiles. It would shake reputations, change lives, and remind the world that sometimes the smallest voices carry the deepest echoes. Because Eli didn't come to entertain, he came to remember. The violin in Eli's lap that night wasn't just wood and strings, it was a door. A key to a past no one had talked about in years, a past buried under silence, struggle, and shame. What Garrett Langston had unwittingly placed in that boy's hands wasn't just an instrument. It was a legacy. One that had been silenced by time and circumstance. One that was ready to sing again. Back in the South Bronx, Eli's world was a far cry from the chandelier-lit gardens of Martha's Vineyard. His room was small, tucked above the laundromat run by Mrs. Medina, an older Dominican woman who had known Sophie since before Eli was born. The paint on the walls peeled in quiet curls. The mattress was thin, but by the window sat a single folding chair and a music stand held together with tape. And in the mornings before school, before Sophie went to her first shift at the diner, Eli would sit there and play. The violin he practiced on was old. The varnish was scratched and 2 tuning pegs had to be jammed in with bits of cardboard. But when he pulled the bow across the strings, something happened. Something that made neighbors pause on the stairs. That made Mrs. Medina sit on the edge of her bed and close her eyes. It wasn't just sound. It was longing memory soul. Eli didn't know why it made people cry. He just knew it made him feel less alone. Sophie told him once music runs in our family baby. Not just like talent, more like breath. But she didn't talk about her father much. Arturo Alvarez was a name Eli only knew through whispers, an old photograph in a frame, a black and white ticket stub from a club in Chicago, and one broken string that Sophie kept in a box with a faded note, "Play, even when they won't listen." He had been a violinist in the 1950s, a prodigy who could have stood on any stage if only his skin had been lighter. He played in back alleys and smoky jazz clubs sometimes behind curtains because certain venues didn't allow men like him to be seen. They called him the Phantom. He never recorded an album, never signed a label deal. His music existed in fragments carried by memory and stories. By the time Sophie was a teenager, he had stopped playing altogether. The world didn't want his sound, she once said. So he stopped making it. But what she never told Eli, not until the night before that fateful gala, was that Arturo had once played the very same Guarneri violin, now sitting in Garrett Langston's collection. A violin he'd lost to a pawn shop when medical bills overwhelmed him in 1971. A violin Garrett bought at an auction years later, purely as a decorative piece. Neither of them knew. Not until Eli touched it. That night, while the guests laughed and sipped wine outside, Isaac Moreno, quiet, thoughtful, nearly invisible, sat on a bench near the edge of the property. He had been the groundskeeper for 15 years. Before that, he taught music at a public high school in Queens. He had a gift for recognizing talent. And when he heard the strains of Eli's practice sessions earlier that day, just a few bars, nothing more, he knew he was hearing something rare. So when he saw the boy holding the violin, trembling under the weight of Garrett's cruel request, something clicked. He approached Sophie discreetly near the servants' entrance. "Your son. Where did he learn to play like that?" he asked. Sophie's answer was quiet. He learned it by listening. Isaac didn't hesitate. "I want to help him, just for tonight, please." He led Eli to a quiet corner near the greenhouse where the lights didn't reach, and the sounds from the party were a distant hum. There, in the soft shadows, he handed Eli a different violin, an old, carefully kept piece he'd once used to teach students decades ago. "This isn't much," Isaac said, "but she sings when played with heart." They sat together for an hour. Isaac taught him how to hold his breath before a crescendo, how to feel the silence between notes, how to let memory shape melody. And then he asked Eli, "Who taught you?" "My Grandpa Eli," answered without hesitation, "even if I never met him. I think he still teaches me." Isaac nodded slowly. "That's how you know you're carrying something sacred." It was then that Sophie approached, tears in her eyes. She had been listening the whole time. In her hands, she held a small envelope. Inside, a faded letter written by Arturo in the final weeks of his life. She had never shown it to Eli. "He wrote this for you," she said, voice trembling, "but I wasn't sure when to give it." Eli unfolded the paper. The handwriting was shaky, but the message was clear. "Mi querido nieto. If you are reading this, you must have found the music. It means it never left us. That, even though I never played in Carnegie or Lincoln Center or anywhere they said I didn't belong, the music still lives in our blood. Play it even when they don't want to hear. Especially then, play it for the silence. Play it for me." He didn't cry, not at first, but Sophie did, and Isaac did too. Because in that moment they all knew this performance wasn't about pleasing Garrett Langston. It wasn't even about impressing guests. It was about breaking the silence that had wrapped itself around their family for generations. That's the part people forget. Genius doesn't always look like privilege. It doesn't wear tuxedos or study in Paris. Sometimes it sits in a laundromat, stringing notes together in the dim light of dawn. Sometimes it rolls into a garden party in a wheelchair, carrying a legacy no one thought to look for. That's what Eli was. A living echo of everything that had once been denied. A whisper of music that refused to be forgotten. And as the time ticked closer to his moment before the crowd, Isaac leaned down and said one last thing. "Play what they took from your grandfather. Give it back to the world. You only need one song." Eli nodded. He looked at his mother, looked at the stars, looked at the violin that wasn't his but somehow always had been. And somewhere inside him Arturo's voice whispered clear and steady. "Play, even when they won't listen." The stage waited. So did the silence. But this time Eli wasn't afraid of either, because for the first time he understood that music didn't just belong in concert halls. It belonged in memory, in pain, in hope. It belonged to those who had carried it without applause, without permission. It belonged to him. The guests had no idea what was about to happen. They sat with their champagne flutes half full, and their laughter light, unconcerned. The patio sparkled under strands of lights wrapped through the trees, and the air hummed with the soft sounds of classical piano piped in from hidden speakers. Garrett Langston stood at the head of the long outdoor table, grinning with the confidence of a man who believed he controlled every outcome. His suit was flawless, his voice polished, his intentions anything but kind. And now he announced, raising his glass, a little performance to warm our hearts. There were scattered claps, a few raised brows, but mostly disinterest. These people didn't come to be surprised. They came to be affirmed of their wealth, their taste, their place in the world. Eli sat just beyond the garden lights, the borrowed violin resting in his lap, his mother's eyes locked on his. Sophie had tried to shield him. She had begged Garrett not to go through with it, but power has a way of speaking louder than pleading. "You don't have to do this," she whispered again, kneeling beside him. But Eli shook his head. "It's not about them anymore." Then he wheeled forward. The murmurs quieted as he rolled into the clearing near the small platform where musicians had once played string quartets for Garrett's spring dinners. A few guests tilted their heads. Some smiled in patronizing encouragement. A child in a wheelchair, how quaint, how brave. Garrett gestured dramatically toward the boy. "Ladies and gentlemen, I give you young Mr. Alvarez." Eli lifted the violin. His hands were steady, though his heart beat like a drum inside his chest. He didn't look at Garrett. He didn't look at the faces watching him. He closed his eyes, and he played. At first, the notes were delicate, like testing the temperature of a room. A single phrase, then another. The bow moved gently across the strings, and something inside the violin awakened. Isaac's instrument, though old, responded as if it had been waiting for this exact pair of hands. The piece was Arturo's, Ballad for the Unheard, a melody that had never graced a record, that had never touched a stage, only passed through memory from father to daughter to a boy who had never seen the man he now channeled. The sound wrapped around the guests like mist, quiet at first, then swelling with aching beauty. The conversation stopped. The waiters froze mid-step. Somewhere near the back, one of the guests lowered her wine glass, slowly, her mouth slightly open. Because this wasn't a child playing notes. This was grief and love and history, all spilling out through trembling strings. Sophie covered her mouth with both hands. She had heard Eli play 100 times before, but never like this. Never with this kind of stillness rising from him, as though he were listening to something no one else could hear, and simply translating it for the rest of them. A woman in a red silk dress dabbed at her eyes. The man beside her, a film composer from L.A., whispered, "That's impossible." Garrett's face had gone slack. His smirk had vanished. Because this wasn't going the way he planned. This wasn't the humiliation he had orchestrated. This was revelation, and it kept growing. Eli swayed slightly as he played, his body becoming part of the song. The final passage rose like a prayer, fragile but unbreakable. A note held just past the point of comfort, bending into silence. And then it ended. For a moment there was nothing. No clapping, no movement, just stunned quiet. Then from the back a single person began to clap. Slowly, firmly. It was Isaac. Then another joined, and another, until the entire garden thundered with applause, rising like a wave. Eli lowered the violin and opened his eyes. His gaze found his mother. And then, without a word, he wheeled himself back into the shadows. Garrett tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. The people around him had changed. Their expressions weren't admiration anymore, they were judgment. Disbelief. A few guests pulled out their phones, already texting, whispering. A man from a prominent music conservatory leaned to his wife and said, "We need to talk to that boy. Tonight." What Eli had done was more than perform. He had broken something open. He had taken the shame Garrett tried to throw on him and transformed it into something sacred. That's the thing about music. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't follow protocol. When it's real, when it's rooted in pain and love and history, it moves through everything. That night, people didn't just hear Eli Alvarez. They heard every note his grandfather had never been allowed to play. They heard the echo of generations silenced and the quiet resistance of beauty that refuses to disappear. One guest, a journalist from the New Yorker, had been recording. Quietly, discreetly. He didn't know what story he was walking into, but he knew now he had one that mattered. Sophie found her son sitting alone behind the fountain, the violin resting beside him on the bench. She sat down next to him, not speaking at first. "You did it," she whispered finally. Eli looked up at her eyes, full of something neither fear nor pride. Something deeper. I think he was with me." She nodded. "I know he was." The applause still echoed faintly from the garden, but Eli wasn't listening anymore. He had played for the silence, and now the world was listening. But what happened after what rippled outward from that one performance would change more than just their lives. It would reshape everything Garrett Langston thought he controlled. Because when truth is finally spoken, especially through a voice no one expected, it doesn't just fill the room. It rewrites the rules of who belongs there. The morning after the gala, the estate was silent. No buzz of catering vans, no gardeners pruning, no idle chatter among staff. Just the faint scent of damp grass and the echo of something that had changed everything. Garrett Langston sat alone in his sunroom, scrolling through his phone. His face was pale, his jaw clenched tighter with each headline. Boy's violin performance stuns elite gala. Servant's son leaves billionaires in tears. Ballad for the unheard. Heard at last. The video had been posted by the journalist from the New Yorker. It had gone viral overnight. Not because it was sensational, but because it was true. Raw, human, the kind of story that reminded people of what matters. Within hours, major outlets had picked it up. Music blogs, classical publications, even late-night talk shows. But the applause wasn't what shook Garrett. It was the backlash. Donors were calling to postpone future collaborations. A hedge fund he'd partnered with pulled out of a deal, citing misalignment of values. A youth charity withdrew a $5 million pledge after learning the story behind the performance. Because the story wasn't just about a child who played a beautiful piece. It was about a child who had been set up to be humiliated by a man who wore suits worth more than his family's annual income. And people were angry. Isaac had kept his silence for years, but when a local reporter came to the estate, he didn't hold back. He spoke not just of the gala, but of what he'd witnessed over a decade, how staff were treated like ghosts. How Sophie had cleaned bathrooms with a heart condition Garrett knew about, but ignored how employees were let go quietly when they became less presentable. The narrative shifted from gala gossip to something deeper. A reckoning. And Garrett, once lauded as a self-made visionary, became a cautionary tale. But the most powerful fallout wasn't financial, it was emotional. Sophie and Eli returned to the city quietly. They never made a statement. They didn't need to. Their truth had already been heard. But the flood of letters, emails, and invitations poured in like a tide. One message came from a woman in Chicago who had danced to Arturo Alvarez's music in a jazz club in 1959. She wrote, "I never forgot that melody. I think your boy brought it back to life." Another came from a boy in Kansas, also in a wheelchair, who said, "I didn't know someone like me could do something like that." Eli read every word, sometimes with a quiet smile, sometimes through tears, because what he had done wasn't just play music. He had given people something they hadn't known they were missing: hope. He had reminded the world that art matters not because of prestige, but because of honesty. That beauty is most powerful when it comes from the places we least expect. And Garrett, he tried to recover, issued a statement about celebrating diversity and overcoming adversity, but no one bought it. What he had planned as a performance of pity had become a mirror, and people saw through him. The lesson was clear. Never underestimate the power of a story told through truth, especially when it's played on strings that remember everything. One day, about 2 weeks later, Isaac stopped by Sophie's apartment. He brought a box. Inside was Arturo's original violin, the one from South Bronx lovingly restored. A donor from a conservatory in Philadelphia had paid for its repairs after seeing the video. "He's ready," Isaac said softly. Sophie nodded. "He's always been." Later that week, Eli received an invitation from Berkeley, not just for a scholarship but to perform at their youth showcase. A spotlight slot, center stage, no curtains, no limits. And for once, Sophie didn't have to worry about affording medicine, about paying rent, about whether her son's talent would go unnoticed, because the world had finally seen him. Sometimes, the most powerful revolutions don't start with protests or speeches. Sometimes, they begin with a child, a song, and a moment someone thought wouldn't matter. But music, real music, never disappears. It waits. And then, when the time is right, it changes everything. 1 year later, the vineyard looked different. The once bustling Langston estate was quiet, its lavish gardens overgrown, its marble fountains dry. The Gala tents were long gone, the music too. What remained was only memory and regret. Garrett Langston, once the crown prince of coastal real estate, now lived in a modest cottage 5 miles inland. The empire he'd built with boardroom charm and manicured cruelty had collapsed under the weight of truth. One article at a time, one canceled deal at a time. But the thing that haunted him most wasn't financial. It was the silence. Because no matter where he went, he couldn't escape the sound of that violin. That single night, that single song played by a boy he had dismissed as invisible had become the moment people remembered Garrett Langston's name, not as a mogul, but as a man brought down by a melody. And yet, that same melody had built something new. In New York, Sophie Alvarez stood backstage at Lincoln Center holding her breath as she watched her son prepare to perform. The hall was packed. Not with the privileged, not with the powerful, but with people who had followed Eli's journey. Teachers, musicians, kids from schools that had cut their music programs but now fought to bring them back. Survivors of silence. Eli stood at the edge of the stage in his chair, dressed in a navy blazer and dark slacks. He looked taller than he had a year ago, not in height, but in spirit. He carried himself like someone who had found not just his voice but his place. Tonight's concert was special. It was a tribute titled Songs We Never Heard. A collection of compositions lost to time, to discrimination, to poverty, performed now for the first time. Eli had chosen the final piece himself. He rolled onto the stage slowly as the lights dimmed and the audience quieted. And then he spoke. "My grandfather," he began, "was a violinist who never got to play on stages like this. He was told he didn't belong. His music stayed in kitchens, back rooms, and alleyways. But it never stopped being music. It never stopped being beautiful. Tonight I want to play the song he wrote but never got to finish. I wrote the last part. I think he would have liked that." He lifted his bow. The opening notes were soft, familiar. The same ballad from a year ago, but gentler now, less desperate, more certain. The melody wove through the hall like a memory returning home. But then, halfway through, Eli played something new, a coda, a bright, reaching finale that stretched beyond Arturo's final measure. Notes that soared and lifted, that turned pain into promise. People cried, not because the music was sad, but because it was whole. And backstage, Sophie wept silently, not just for what had been overcome, but for what had been reclaimed. She thought of her father, of her mother's quiet grief, of the years when hope felt like something for other families. Eli finished the piece and the hall erupted, but he didn't bow. He simply nodded once, as if to say, "This was never about me." Because in many ways it wasn't. It was about every person who had ever been told they were too small, too poor, too different to matter. And in the back row of the auditorium, wearing a gray suit that didn't quite fit, Garrett Langston sat alone. No one noticed him. No one greeted him. He hadn't come for redemption. He knew that was no longer his to claim. But when Eli played that final note, Garrett stood and clapped. Not because he expected anyone to see, but because even he couldn't deny the truth. Sometimes the smallest voices are the ones that echo the longest. After the concert, as the crowd spilled into the lobby, a young girl approached Eli. She was no older than 7, clutching a battered violin case. Her father followed behind her, quiet, watching. "Your music," she said, eyes wide, "made me feel like I can do it too." Eli smiled. "You can. Just start with one note." And she did. That summer, Eli was invited to record an album ballad for the unheard, featuring works by unknown composers from marginalized backgrounds. It wasn't just a debut, it was a declaration. Sophie, meanwhile, began teaching again, first part-time, then full-time through a community arts initiative sparked by Eli's story. She taught children who had never touched an instrument, who thought beauty was something other people created. And every time she saw a child's eyes light up at their first sound, she thought, this is where it starts. It always starts with one. One person willing to believe. One song played with truth. One moment that interrupts the story we thought we were living. A year ago, Eli had rolled into a garden party as a boy they didn't want to see. Now, the world was listening. And in that quiet waiting space between the last note and the first clap, something had shifted, not just for him, but for all of us. Because the real power of music isn't just in how it sounds, it's in who gets to play it. Eli Alvarez's story isn't just about music, it's about transformation. It's about how a single act intended to shame became the spark that revealed a forgotten legacy and redefined the future for a boy no one expected to shine. In a world where power often silences the quiet, Eli reminded us that real strength speaks softly. And sometimes it sings. From the worn-out apartment above a laundromat in the South Bronx to the glowing stage of Lincoln Center, Eli's journey defied expectations. He was never supposed to belong in those spaces, not because he lacked talent, but because society rarely makes room for those without privilege. And yet, when handed a moment meant to diminish him, he transformed it into something unforgettable. It all started with a cruel setup, a billionaire's twisted attempt to use a child for entertainment, assuming no one would care if he failed. But Garrett Langston didn't know that Eli carried more than a violin. He carried history, memory, the echo of a grandfather who was never given the chance to be heard. In that one performance, Eli didn't just play notes, he played everything that had ever been taken from his family. And when the final note faded, it wasn't silence that followed. It was change. The story could have ended there with applause, with headlines, with redemption. But what truly matters is what came next. Eli didn't chase fame. He didn't bask in the glow of his sudden recognition. He turned it into purpose, into a platform for unheard voices, into a space where children who looked like him, lived like him, could see themselves in the music. Sophie, too, found her place not just as a mother, but as a mentor, a guide. Her sacrifices had always been quiet. Cleaning homes, skipping meals, giving up her own dreams. But in Eli's triumph, her own story found a second beginning. She became the teacher her father had once been. And in every child she now helps, Arturo's spirit lives on. Even Garrett's downfall holds meaning. Not because he suffered, but because his loss reminded us of the dangers of pride, of what happens when we mistake control for character. His empire crumbled not from scandal alone, but from the emptiness behind it. His fall was inevitable because it was built on silence, not sincerity. Eli's story teaches us that genius doesn't come wrapped in status. that greatness doesn't require permission, that the most powerful performances are often the ones no one saw coming, and perhaps most importantly, that every child, no matter their zip code, skin color, ability, or last name, deserves a chance to be seen, to be heard, to be believed in. But there's something even deeper here, a truth about how we respond when we are tested. Eli could have said no, could have walked away, let fear or anger swallow the moment, and no one would have blamed him. But instead he showed us grace, not weakness, not submission. Grace. The kind of quiet courage that speaks louder than rage, that stands firm not to prove a point but to hold a legacy. This story is a reminder that dignity doesn't require a stage, that the greatest victories are not always loud, they are often found in the stillness of someone choosing hope over hate, art over ego, love over bitterness. So, what can we take from this into our own lives? We can choose to see the people around us more clearly. The bus driver with the tired eyes, the janitor humming to himself, the child in the back of the class with the tattered backpack. We can ask ourselves, who have we overlooked? Whose story haven't we heard? We can listen more deeply, forgive more freely, be slower to judge and quicker to understand. We can remember that everyone carries something sacred, that sometimes what looks like weakness is actually resilience in disguise, that one act of kindness or cruelty can ripple farther than we ever imagined. And most importantly, we can hold space for others, because when we do, we create room for stories like Eli's to be told, stories that remind us of who we are, who we could be, and how beautiful the world becomes when we choose to make space for the unheard. If this story moved you, if it made you think, cry, reflect, or smile, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing these human stories to life. Stories of hope, of healing, of the power that lives in the quiet corners of the world. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. We can't wait to share the next story with you.